All right, let's just dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to do a real forensic breakdown of one of literature's most explosive protagonists, Okonkwo. We are basically tearing down the engine of Chinua Achebe's classic tragedy to see exactly how its gears turn. We're going to look past just the plot to examine the crushing cultural expectations of masculinity, the creeping pressures of colonialism, and ultimately, the devastating consequences of an inflexible mind.
Now, to really get Okonkwo, we have to understand how Achebe himself views storytelling. He actually stated in an interview once that all storytelling is fundamentally political. Why? Well, because whenever you have people trying to live together harmoniously, you need some kind of arrangement that dictates what enhances that harmony and what disrupts it. So examining these power structures isn't just some dry academic exercise. It's the very heartbeat of why we tell stories to begin with.
So, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the purpose of fiction, move into a classical African tragedy, unpack the burden of masculinity, pinpoint the turning point, and finally, look at the final collapse.
Okay, Section 1, the purpose of fiction. Let's take a quick look at Achebe's philosophical approach to storytelling. The crucial thing to grasp here is that Achebe definitely doesn't view art as this delicate thing to be hidden away from the messy realities of the world. He actually coined this great term, beneficent fiction, to describe storytelling as a creative component of human life with a positive purpose. To him, the idea of keeping fiction apolitical is a relatively recent Western superstition, and one that frankly just benefits the emperor who wants to keep poets out of his business. Art absolutely has to grapple with the big issues: violence, injustice, victimization, and the literal peace and happiness of the planet.
Moving right along to Section 2, a classical African tragedy. We're going to view Okonkwo through Aristotle's lens.
You know, academic analysis points out that Things Fall Apart perfectly maps onto this ancient Greek framework. Aristotle defined a tragedy as an imitation of a serious action where an ideal hero, someone who is prosperous and famous but maybe not perfectly virtuous, experiences a catastrophic downfall. And this downfall isn't just bad luck, right? It stems from a tragic flaw, which is known as hamartia. As we trace Okonkwo's path today, I want you to keep an eye out for how Achebe systematically engineers events to ultimately arouse a deep sense of pity and fear or catharsis in us, the audience.
All right, Section 3, the burden of masculinity. Let's dig into the sociological frameworks over in Umuofia.
Looking at published academic research on gender roles, it's pretty clear how traditional Igbo society in pre-colonial Nigeria built these incredibly rigid expectations of what it meant to be a man. Masculinity in this context isn't just a personal trait, it's a heavy societal imperative that dictates literally every waking move you make.
At the absolute core of Okonkwo's identity is some serious generational trauma. First, you have his father, Unoka, a guy who loved music, played the flute, but ended up dying in massive debt and humiliation. Society viewed him as a total failure. And then you have Okonkwo, the son. His entire hypermasculine persona is basically this frantic, obsessive reaction against his dad's perceived weakness. He associates any kind of gentleness or idleness with femininity, and he is absolutely terrified of being anything like the man who raised him.
So, to make absolutely sure he's nothing like his dad, Okonkwo goes all in on pursuing his society's metrics of success. The sources point out that by the time he's just 18, he brings major honor to his village by throwing Amalinze the cat, this massive wrestler who had been unbeaten for 7 years. He builds wealth by farming yams, which the culture literally calls the king of crops. He gains titles, he leads in intertribal warfare, and he demands absolute, terrifying emotional restraint from himself and his family. He rules his household with a super heavy hand, all out of this perpetual grinding fear of appearing weak.
But here's the wild contradiction. While Okonkwo adopts this incredibly toxic extreme of masculinity, true traditional Igbo culture actually demands a really delicate balance. Sure, it's a fiercely patriarchal society, but it heavily relies on female spiritual power, like the priestess Chielo and the earth goddess Ani. When Okonkwo beats his wife during the sacred week of peace, he flagrantly disregards that balance. His whole interpretation of manhood is an extreme overcorrection, and it totally blinds him to his own culture's harmony.
Which brings us to Section 4, the turning point. These are the fatal choices driven entirely by fear. Looking at this timeline of Okonkwo's life is literally like watching a slow-motion car crash. It perfectly paces out that Aristotelian tragedy we talked about earlier. You see his early rise to prominence through wrestling and wealth, but then look at the climax.
Okonkwo is entrusted with a boy from a neighboring village, Ikemefuna. The boy lives with him for 3 years and even calls him father. But when the oracle decrees the boy has to die, the village elders specifically warn Okonkwo to stay away. But his tragic flaw takes over. Later on, an accidental killing at a funeral, which is ironically classified by the culture as a female crime, shatters his hypermasculine ego and results in a 7-year exile. And that brings us right to the absolute most horrific moment of the novel, the killing of Ikemefuna. The boy literally runs to Okonkwo for protection, crying out, "My father, they have killed me." And Okonkwo strikes the fatal blow. Why? Well, the text literally spells it out for us. He was afraid of being thought weak. This is the ultimate proof of his hamartia. His paralyzing fear of looking like his father overrides his genuine love for the boy. Academic research notes that afterward, Okonkwo couldn't even taste food for 2 days, proving his internal vulnerability was entirely masked by this external aggression. This exact moment is what triggers the profound pity and fear Aristotle said is absolutely required for a true tragedy.
Finally, Section 5, the final collapse. What happens when tradition meets an unstoppable force?
So Okonkwo's rigid mindset proves to be completely incompatible with a shifting landscape. After his 7 years in exile, he comes back hoping to rebuild his status. But he finds Umuofia totally fractured. The British have shown up with a new religion, a new government, and a new court system. Naturally, Okonkwo views the early Christian converts, which, by the way, includes his own son, Nwoye, who he ends up disowning, as effeminate. When the district commissioner's messengers arrive to break up a village meeting, Okonkwo reacts the only way he knows how, with violent, masculine aggression. He draws his sword and beheads their leader, fully expecting his clan to rise up right there with him.
But they don't rise up. Okonkwo just wipes his bloody sword in the sand and walks away, suddenly realizing that his people aren't going to fight the way he envisions. They've compromised, they've adapted, and he is entirely incapable of changing with them. Which brings us to the ultimate question of this whole explainer. What happens when an unbending, hypermasculine force meets the unstoppable reality of a changing world? It snaps.
In a final, tragic act of despair, Okonkwo hangs himself from a tree behind his house. And the irony here is just profound. In Igbo culture, suicide is considered an absolute abomination to the earth goddess. It's an offense so incredibly severe that his own clansmen can't even touch his body. Only strangers are allowed to bury him. He is buried like a dog, as his friend Obierika laments. So I'll leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder. In his desperate, lifelong flight from his father's shameful legacy, Okonkwo built an absolutely insurmountable legend of masculine strength. But that very obsession ultimately guaranteed his total, absolute erasure. What does that tell us about the dangers of the roles we force upon ourselves? Think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the stories around you.